The senior officers cornered her in the corridor, their voices dripping with condescension as they explained how things worked on their base. The young woman listened quietly, her expression unreadable, as they laid out exactly what someone like her could and couldn't do here. What they didn't know, what nobody on the base knew yet, was that the nervous-looking girl they were trying to intimidate wasn't just another junior officer. She was Admiral Irene Hill, and in less than 24 hours, she would reveal an identity that would shatter every assumption they'd made about her. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across Naval Base Poseidon as Irene Hill stepped off the transport vehicle, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. At 28, she looked younger, her delicate features and slight build giving her the appearance of someone fresh out of the bed. Academy, rather than someone carrying the weight of command she actually bore. The base sprawled before her, a fortress of concrete and steel perched on the Croatian coast, home to 3,000 personnel and the operational center for maritime security operations across the Adriatic. Irene had spent the last 3 months studying every detail of this facility from classified briefings in Brussels, but seeing it in person was different. This was her command now, though nobody here knew it yet. Her arrival had been deliberately orchestrated. The official change of command ceremony wasn't scheduled until tomorrow morning, and headquarters had agreed to her unusual request to spend 24 hours on the base incognito. She wanted to see how things really worked when admirals weren't watching, to understand the true culture of the command she was about to assume. The enlisted sailor at the visitor processing center barely glanced up as Irene approached. "Name and purpose of visit," he said, his tone suggesting he'd repeated these words 10,000 times before. "Lieutenant Commander Hill," Irene replied, using her previous rank rather than her current one. "Temporary duty assignment, personnel evaluation." The sailor's eyes flickered with recognition at the mention of personnel evaluation. That particular assignment often meant someone was in trouble, that investigators were looking into problems. His demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more alert but also more guarded. "You'll need to check in with Commander Petrov in the administrative building," he said, handing her a temporary access badge. "Second floor, office 217. Irene thanked him and headed toward the administrative complex, taking in details as she walked. The base was immaculate, its appearance suggesting military precision and high standards. Equipment was properly secured, personnel moved with purpose, and everything visible spoke of a well-run operation. But Irene had learned long ago that what you could see from the surface rarely told the complete story. Commander Viktor Petrov was exactly what Irene had expected based on his service record. 45 years old, 23 years in the Navy, competent but unambitious. He'd been the base's executive officer for 2 years, comfortable in his role as second in command, showing no interest in taking the next step up the ladder. "Lieutenant Commander Hill," Petrov said as she entered his office, his English carrying a slight accent, "we weren't expecting you until later in the week." "Change of plans," Irene replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I wanted to get started early. Observe operations without too much advance notice." Petrov's expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with this development, but he was too professional to show it openly. "Of course. What specifically will you be evaluating? General readiness? Personnel morale? Operational effectiveness?" Irene said vaguely. She'd learned that being specific gave people time to prepare, to hide problems. "I'll need access to most areas of the base. Interview personnel across all departments. That can be arranged," Petrov said, though his tone suggested it would be an inconvenience. "I'll assign someone to escort you, show you around." "That won't be necessary," Irene replied quickly. "I prefer to observe without official escorts. It tends to make people more comfortable, more willing to speak candidly." Petrov studied her for a moment, and Irene could see him trying to assess her. She was young for a lieutenant commander, young enough that her presence on this type of assignment might seem unusual. But her credentials were impeccable, her orders properly authorized, and he had no legitimate reason to refuse her request. "As you wish," he finally said. "But please be aware that some areas require proper authorization before entry. Security protocols must be maintained." Of course, Irene agreed. I'll respect all security procedures. As she left Petrov's office, Irene allowed herself a small smile. The first test had been passed. She'd established her cover, gained the access she needed, and set the stage for what would come next. The base cafeteria was crowded when Irene arrived for lunch, having spent the morning touring the facilities and introducing herself to various personnel as a lieutenant commander conducting routine evaluations. The reactions had been mixed, some viewing her with suspicion, others with the casual dismissiveness that young-looking officers often encountered. She grabbed a tray and joined the queue, listening to the conversations around her. This was where real culture revealed itself, in the casual interactions of personnel when they thought nobody important was watching. "Did you hear about the new evaluator?" A voice behind her said. "Fresh-faced kid, looks like she should still be in school." "Probably connected," another voice replied. "You know how it is, someone's daughter getting an easy assignment to pad her resume." Irene kept her expression neutral, focusing on selecting her meal. This was exactly why she'd wanted these 24 hours. The assumptions people made, the casual dismissiveness, it all revealed truths that would be hidden once she revealed her actual rank. She found an empty seat at a table near the windows, deliberately choosing a spot where she could observe without being the center of attention. As she ate, she noticed patterns in how personnel interacted. There were clear hierarchies, established groups, the social structure that existed in any military organization. 3 officers entered the cafeteria, their bearing suggesting senior rank even before Irene noted the insignia on their uniforms. Lieutenant commanders, all of them, the tier just below full commanders, the level where officers started wielding significant authority but hadn't yet learned the restraint that came with higher responsibility. They noticed her, immediately, their eyes locking onto the unfamiliar face at the corner table. Irene could see them conferring among themselves, making the decision to approach. She continued eating, giving no indication that she'd noticed their attention. "You're the evaluator," one of them said as they reached her table. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. "Lieutenant Commander Hill, right?" "That's correct," Irene replied, looking up calmly. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Commander Brennan," he said, not bothering with his first name as if his rank and surname should be sufficient. "This is Lieutenant Commander Volkov and Lieutenant Commander Torres. We heard someone was poking around, asking questions about our operations." The way Brennan emphasized our operations made clear that he considered this his territory, that Irene's presence was an intrusion. She set down her fork and gave him her full attention, noting how the other 2 officers positioned themselves, forming a loose semicircle that was just aggressive enough to be intimidating without being overtly hostile. "I'm conducting a standard personnel evaluation," Irene said evenly. "Nothing unusual about that." "Nothing unusual about the timing?" Volkov asked, his accent suggesting Russian heritage. "Right before the change of command ceremony? Seems like someone in Brussels doesn't trust us to present well for the new admiral." Irene took a sip of water, using the moment to observe their body language. They were testing her, pushing to see how she'd react to confrontation. It was a dynamic she'd encountered throughout her career, the particular kind of challenge that came when men decided a young woman didn't belong in their space. "The timing is coincidental," she replied. "These evaluations are scheduled months in advance. If it happens to align with other events, that's just how the calendar worked out." "Coincidental," Torres repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it. "You know what I think? I think someone sent a junior officer to dig up dirt to find problems that don't exist so they can justify making changes when the new admiral arrives." "I'm not looking for dirt," Irene said calmly. "I'm looking at operational effectiveness, personnel readiness, the standard metrics that any well-run command should be able to demonstrate without difficulty." Brennan leaned forward, placing his hands on the table in a gesture that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Let me explain something to you, Lieutenant Commander. This base runs smoothly because we know how to get things done. We don't need some outsider, some kid who probably got this assignment through connections, coming in and questioning our methods." Irene met his gaze steadily, her expression giving nothing away. Inside, she was cataloging every word, every gesture, building a picture of the command climate that would inform decisions she'd make once she revealed her actual authority. "I'm not questioning your methods," she said. "I'm observing operations and speaking with personnel. If your methods are sound, that will be reflected in my report." "Your report," Volkov said with a slight laugh. "Do you even know what you're looking for? Have you ever served on a base like this, dealt with the operational tempo we maintain, the challenges we face?" "I've served in various capacities," Irene replied carefully. "Each assignment provides different perspectives." Torres shook his head dismissively. "Different perspectives. That's Brussels speak for someone who's never done real operational work, who spent their career pushing papers and attending meetings." The assumption stung because it was so far from the truth. But Irene maintained her composure. She'd commanded a destroyer at 26, had led operations in the Black Sea during heightened tensions, had earned her position through demonstrated competence under pressure, but revealing that now would undermine the purpose of this exercise. "I understand you're concerned about an outsider evaluating your operations," Irene said, her tone remaining professional despite the provocations. "That's natural. But I'm here regardless of your feelings about it, and I'll complete my assignment." Brennan straightened, his expression hardening. "Let me make something clear, Lieutenant Commander. This base has standards. We maintain discipline, we expect respect for the chain of command, and we don't appreciate junior officers who forget their place." "I haven't forgotten my place," Irene replied quietly. "Have you?" The challenge hung in the air between them. For a moment, Brennan looked like he might escalate further, but then Volkov put a hand on his shoulder. "Come on," Volkov said. "We've got the operations briefing in 15 minutes. The evaluator can find her own way around." As they walked away, Irene heard Torres mutter something about typical headquarters, princess that drew chuckles from his companions. She watched them leave, then returned to her meal, though her appetite had diminished. This was worse than she had expected. The casual dismissiveness, the subtle intimidation, the assumption that she didn't belong or deserve respect based solely on her appearance and apparent youth, it all painted a picture of a command climate that needed significant adjustment. She spent the afternoon touring maintenance facilities and speaking with enlisted personnel. Here, the reception was different. Without the posturing of officers protecting their territory, the sailors were more open, more willing to discuss the realities of their work. A young technician named Corporal Jensen was particularly forthcoming as he showed Irene through the communication center. "The equipment is good," he said, "but we're always short-handed. They cut our manning levels last year, said we could do more with less, but it just means longer shifts and less downtime for maintenance." "Have you reported these concerns through your chain of command?" Irene asked. Jensen's expression suggested that was a naive question. "Ma'am, begging your pardon, but reporting concerns doesn't really work the way it's supposed to. The senior officers, they're more interested in looking good on paper than addressing actual problems." "Can you be more specific?" Irene pressed gently. He hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of being candid with someone he'd just met. Finally, he said, "Let's just say that when problems are identified, the focus is usually on hiding them rather than fixing them. Makes the reports look better, keeps everyone happy except the people actually doing the work." Irene made mental notes, adding this to the growing picture of a command that prioritized appearance over substance. It wasn't uncommon in large organizations, but it was exactly the kind of problem she'd been sent here to address. As evening approached, she headed toward the officers' quarters where she'd been assigned temporary accommodation. The base had quieted somewhat, the frenetic energy of the day giving way to the more relaxed atmosphere of off-duty hours. She was halfway across the parade ground when she heard footsteps behind her, moving quickly. She turned to find Brennan approaching, alone this time, his expression suggesting he had more to say. "Lieutenant Commander Hill," he called out, his voice carrying across the open space. "I think we need to have a conversation about expectations." Irene stopped and waited as he closed the distance between them. The sun was setting behind the base's main buildings, casting long shadows that made the moment feel more ominous than it should have. "What expectations would those be?" she asked when he reached her. Brennan crossed his arms, his posture aggressive despite the casual setting. "The expectation that evaluators conduct themselves professionally, that they don't waste our time with pointless questions, and that they remember who actually runs things around here." "I'm quite clear on who runs things," Irene replied calmly. Are you? His eyes narrowed. You know what your problem is? You come in here with your credentials and your authority, but you don't have any real experience. You've never commanded anything significant, never had to make the hard decisions we make every day. Irene let the accusations wash over her, recognizing them for what they were, assumptions based on her apparent youth and gender, rather than any actual knowledge of her background. It would have been satisfying to correct him, to reveal that she'd commanded more, experienced more, and proven more than he likely ever would. But that wasn't the point of this exercise. I'll be filing my report based on what I observe and what I learn from personnel interviews, she said instead. If that concerns you, perhaps you should consider why. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Brennan's jaw tightened at her response, his hands clenching briefly before he forced them to relax. You think you're clever, don't you? Coming in here, stirring things up right before the new Admiral arrives. But let me tell you something about Admiral Hill. Irene's pulse quickened slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. What about the Admiral? Word is she's young, inexperienced, got the position through political connections rather than merit, Brennan said, his tone dripping with disdain. Brussels forced her on us because they wanted to make some statement about diversity or progressiveness or whatever nonsense they're pushing these days. She probably doesn't know the first thing about running a real operational command. That's quite an assumption about someone you've never met, Irene observed carefully. I've met plenty of her type, Brennan continued. Officers who look good in photos, who say the right things in meetings, but who crumble when faced with actual challenges. This base deserves better than some political appointee playing Admiral. Irene studied him for a long moment, memorizing every word, every contemptuous gesture. This wasn't just casual dismissiveness anymore. This was active insubordination against a commanding officer he hadn't even met yet, based purely on assumptions about her age and gender. The change of command is tomorrow morning, she said quietly. Perhaps you should reserve judgment until you've actually served under Admiral Hill's command. Brennan laughed, a harsh sound without humor. I've been in this Navy for 15 years. I know how to read between the lines of official announcements. And everything about this appointment screams political favor rather than earned authority. Then I suppose tomorrow will be enlightening for you, Irene replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a report to prepare. She walked away before he could respond, her shoulders straight and her pace measured. Behind her, she heard him mutter something crude under his breath, but she didn't turn around. Tomorrow would come soon enough. In her temporary quarters, Irene sat at the small desk and began typing her preliminary observations. The technical operations appeared sound, the equipment well maintained, the enlisted personnel competent and dedicated. But the officer corps showed signs of entrenched attitudes that would undermine any command's effectiveness. She documented the confrontations, the casual dismissiveness, the prejudgments about her supposed incompetence. More concerning was what Corporal Jensen had hinted at, the culture of hiding problems rather than addressing them. That suggested deeper issues that would require significant attention. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from Vice Admiral Laurent in Brussels. How's the reconnaissance going? Irene typed back, revealing. The technical operation is solid, but the command climate needs work. Some officers are going to be very surprised tomorrow. Looking forward to the reports, Laurent replied. Remember, this was your idea. Some of us thought it was risky. It had been risky, Irene acknowledged. Going undercover on her own base before assuming command was unconventional, possibly even inappropriate by some standards. But she'd argued successfully that understanding the true culture, seeing how personnel really behaved when they thought no admiral was watching, would make her a more effective commander. She finished her notes and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would reshape everything. The officers who dismissed her, who tried to intimidate her, who'd made assumptions about her capabilities, they were all about to learn a lesson about judging people by appearances. As she turned off the light, Irene thought about Brennan's words regarding Admiral Hill. She, Probably doesn't know the first thing about running a real operational command. Tomorrow morning, she would show him exactly how wrong he was. Morning arrived with a kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for ceremonies. Irene woke at 0500, earlier than necessary, but sleep had been elusive. Today she would step into her role as the base's commanding officer, and nothing would be the same afterward. She dressed carefully in her service dress uniform, the one she'd kept hidden in her duffel bag throughout yesterday's reconnaissance. The shoulder boards bearing an admiral's stars felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge of what was coming. She studied herself in the mirror, seeing both the young woman who'd been dismissed yesterday and the admiral who would command respect today. The change of command ceremony was scheduled for 0900 at the parade ground. Irene had deliberately arranged to arrive early, to be present for the setup, to observe how her officers prepared when they thought she hadn't arrived yet. She left her quarters at 0630, walking across the base as the sun climbed higher. Personnel were already moving with purpose, preparing for the formal ceremony. None of them recognized her in her admiral's uniform, the transformation from yesterday's lieutenant commander apparently complete enough to make her unrecognizable. Near the parade ground, she found a position where she could observe without being immediately noticed. The setup was proceeding efficiently, chairs arranged in precise rows, flags positioned correctly, the podium placed exactly where protocol demanded. Commander Petrov supervised the arrangements, his attention to detail evident in how he corrected minor imperfections. But it was the officers gathered near the administrative building who drew Irene's attention. Brennan, Volkov, and Torres stood in a loose circle, their body language suggesting a private conversation they didn't want overheard. Irene moved closer, using a supply truck as cover, positioning herself where she could hear without being seen. "I'm telling you, this is going to be a disaster," Brennan was saying. An admiral who probably got the position because she looks good in photos and checks some diversity box will spend the next year dealing with her incompetence while trying to keep the base actually functioning. "You don't know that," Petrov's voice interjected. He'd apparently joined the group. Admiral Hill's service record is impressive. Destroyer command at a young age, operational experience in contested waters, commendations for tactical excellence. Service records can be manufactured, Volkov replied dismissively. Political appointments come with manufactured credentials. You'll see. She'll be all talk and no substance. And that evaluator yesterday, Torres added, probably sent ahead to identify anyone who might question the new admiral's authority. We need to be careful, make sure we don't give them ammunition to use against us. Irene almost smiled at the irony. They were right about the connection between the evaluator and the admiral, just completely wrong about the nature of that connection. "The ceremony starts in 2 hours, Petrov said, his tone suggesting he wanted to end this conversation. "Whatever your concerns, I expect professional conduct. Admiral Hill is our commanding officer, and she'll be treated with the respect that rank deserves." "Of course," Brennan replied, though his tone suggested compliance rather than genuine respect. "We'll play the part, say the right things. But privately, we all know what this really is." They dispersed to their various duties, leaving Irene standing alone behind the supply truck. She'd heard enough. The prejudgment was even worse than yesterday's interactions had suggested. They'd already decided she was incompetent before meeting her, based purely on assumptions about how she'd obtained her position. She emerged from cover and walked toward the parade ground, her admiral's uniform drawing immediate attention from enlisted personnel who snapped to attention as she passed. Word spread quickly, whispers rippling through the gathering crowd. "The admiral's here. That's Admiral Hill. She's so young." Commander Petrov noticed the commotion and turned, his eyes widening as he recognized the face from yesterday, now wearing an admiral's stars. He approached quickly, his expression a mixture of shock and professional composure. "Admiral Hill," he said, saluting crisply, "welcome to Base Poseidon. We weren't expecting you to arrive until closer to the ceremony start time." "I like to observe preparations," Irene replied, returning his salute. "It tells you a lot about an organization." Petrov's face had gone slightly pale, clearly processing the implications of yesterday's encounters. "Admiral, about yesterday, if I had known, you treated me exactly as you would any lieutenant commander conducting an evaluation," Irene interrupted. "That's appropriate. though I noticed some of your fellow officers were less professional. Yes, ma'am, Petrov said carefully. If there were any inappropriate interactions, I apologize on behalf of the command staff. Don't apologize for them, Irene said firmly. They'll have the opportunity to apologize for themselves. The change of command ceremony proceeded with military precision. Vice Admiral Laurent had flown in from Brussels to officiate, his presence lending additional weight to the proceedings. 3,000 personnel filled the parade ground, standing in formation under the Mediterranean sun. Irene stood on the platform, watching the assembled crowd as Laurent began his remarks. She could see the senior officers in the front rows, their faces showing varying degrees of shock as they processed what they were seeing. Brennan looked like he'd been struck. Volkov's usual confident expression had been replaced with something approaching: panic. Torres kept glancing at his fellow officers as if seeking confirmation that this was really happening. It is my honor to preside over this change of command, Laurent was saying, his voice carrying across the parade ground. Naval Base Poseidon plays a crucial role in our maritime security operations, and it requires a commander of exceptional skill and vision. Irene maintained her composure, her expression calm and professional, but inside she was acutely aware of every eye upon her. This was the moment when perception would begin to shift, when the dismissiveness of yesterday would collide with the reality of today. Admiral Irene Hill comes to this command with a distinguished record of service, Laurent continued. She commanded the destroyer Resolute at 26, the youngest officer to hold that position in a generation. Her tactical innovations during Black Sea operations earned her the Distinguished Service Medal. Her leadership transformed every unit she served. With each accomplishment Laurent listed was another hammer blow to the assumptions that had been made about her. Irene watched Brennan's face growing progressively redder, saw the way Torres had gone very still, noticed Volkov's jaw clenching. More importantly, Laurent said, Admiral Hill understands that effective command requires understanding the true nature of an organization, not just its official reports and formal presentations, which is why she spent yesterday conducting what I believe was a very informative reconnaissance of this base. A murmur rippled through the crowd as personnel processed this revelation. The young lieutenant commander who'd been asking questions yesterday was the admiral assuming command today. The implications of that were enormous. Laurent turned to Irene. Admiral Hill, I hereby transfer command of Naval Base Poseidon to you. May you serve with honor and distinction. I relieve you, sir, Irene replied formally, then turned to address the Folktays, assembled personnel. This was her moment, the first words she would speak to her command as their admiral. Personnel of Naval Base Poseidon, she began, her voice clear and strong. I'm honored to assume command of this installation. Over the past 24 hours, I've had the opportunity to observe your operations, to speak with many of you, to see both the strengths and challenges of this command. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the formation. I've seen exceptional dedication from enlisted personnel who work long hours with limited resources. I've seen technical excellence in how equipment is maintained and operations are conducted. I've also seen attitudes among some officers that concern me deeply. The parade ground had gone very quiet. This was not the typical change of command speech filled with platitudes and general praise. I heard myself described yesterday as a political appointee who knows nothing about real operational command. Irene continued, her voice calm but firm. I heard assumptions that I obtained this position through connections rather than merit. I experienced dismissiveness and subtle intimidation from officers who decided I didn't belong here based on my appearance and apparent youth. Brennan had gone pale now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Around him, other officers shifted uncomfortably, wondering if they'd been among those who'd made such assumptions. Let me be absolutely clear about my expectations, Irene said. I don't care about your assumptions. I don't care if you think I'm too young, too inexperienced, or too anything else. What I care about is whether you can do your job with competence and professionalism, whether you can lead your people effectively, whether you can maintain the standards this Navy demands. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. I also care deeply about the command climate we maintain here. A culture where problems are hidden rather than addressed, where junior personnel feel unable to voice legitimate concerns. where assumptions about capability are based on appearance rather than demonstrated performance. That is not acceptable. Irene's words hung in the air, each one landing with deliberate weight. The assembled personnel stood at attention, but she could see the shifting dynamics, the way enlisted sailors stood a little straighter, the way some officers looked increasingly uncomfortable. Over the coming weeks, I will be meeting with each department, reviewing operations in detail, and speaking with personnel at all levels, she continued. I'm not interested in witch hunts or retribution. I'm interested in building a command that operates with excellence, where every person's contribution is valued and where leadership is earned through competence rather than assumed through rank alone. She paused, making eye contact with the senior officers in the front rows. For those who demonstrated professionalism yesterday, who treated a lieutenant commander conducting an evaluation with the respect that rank deserved, you have my appreciation. For those who chose intimidation and dismissiveness, you have an opportunity to demonstrate that yesterday does not reflect your true character. The ceremony concluded with the traditional formalities, the reading of orders, the symbolic transfer of the base flag. But everyone present understood that something significant had just occurred. The new admiral had not only assumed command, she'd done so by exposing the prejudices and assumptions that had been operating beneath the surface. As the formation dispersed, Irene remained on the platform, watching personnel return to their duties. Commander Petrov approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Admiral, your quarters are prepared," he said. "I've also compiled the briefing materials you'll need for your first operational review." "Thank you, Commander," Irene replied. "I'd like to meet with the senior staff at 1,400 hours, all department heads and officer leadership." "Yes, ma'am. I'll make the arrangements." He hesitated, then added, "Admiral, if I may say so, your approach yesterday was unconventional but effective. I think many of us needed to see beyond our assumptions." "We all have assumptions, Commander," Irene said. "The question is whether we're willing to challenge them when we're proven wrong." As Petrov left to organize the meeting, Irene noticed 3 officers approaching the platform. Brennan, Volkov, and Torres walked together, their body language suggesting they'd drawn straws for who would speak first. "Admiral Hill," Brennan said, saluting formally. His voice was controlled, but Irene could hear the tension underlying it. "We request a moment of your time." "Of course," Irene replied, descending from the platform to stand at eye level with them. She was shorter than all 3, a fact that seemed to register differently now than it had yesterday. There was a long moment of silence, none of them apparently certain how to begin. Finally, Brennan spoke, his words clearly prepared. "Admiral, we owe you an apology. Our behavior yesterday was unprofessional and disrespectful. We made assumptions about your capabilities and your right to be here that were completely unfounded. You made assumptions about a lieutenant commander you didn't know," Irene corrected. "You also made assumptions about an admiral you'd never met. The rank shouldn't matter to whether someone deserves basic professional respect." Volkov stepped forward. "You're right, ma'am. We allowed our preconceptions about age and gender to override our professional judgment. It won't happen again." "I hope that's true," Irene said, her tone neither accepting nor rejecting the apology. "But words are easy. What matters is whether your behavior changes, whether you're willing to examine not just how you treated me, but how you treat every junior officer, every enlisted sailor, everyone who doesn't fit your preconception of what a military professional should look like." Torres spoke up for the first time. "Admiral, I know we have no right to ask for anything, but we'd like the opportunity to prove that yesterday doesn't define who we are as officers." Irene studied the 3 of them, seeing genuine discomfort, but also something that might be genuine recognition of their mistakes. "You'll have that opportunity," she finally said. "This command needs experienced officers who can lead effectively. If you're willing to be those officers, willing to maintain the standards I expect, then we'll move forward." "Thank you, ma'am," Brennan said, though the relief in his voice was tempered by understanding that they remained on probation. The senior staff meeting at 1,400 hours was unlike any change of command briefing the officers had experienced before. Irene sat at the head of the conference table, her notes spread before her, as 15 department heads and senior officers filed in and took their seats. The atmosphere was tense, everyone uncertain about what to expect from an admiral who'd already proven she didn't follow conventional patterns. "Thank you all for being here," Irene began once everyone was settled. "I want to use this meeting to establish expectations and priorities for this command. But first, I want to address the elephant in the room. Yesterday's reconnaissance was unconventional, and some of you are probably wondering whether you're about to face consequences for how you interacted with me." The room remained silent, though several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Here's what I learned yesterday," Irene continued. "This base has excellent technical capabilities, dedicated enlisted personnel, and strong operational procedures. It also has a command climate that discourages honest reporting of problems, that prioritizes appearance over substance, and that allows assumptions about capability to override demonstrated performance." She pulled out her notes, organized during the early morning hours. "Corporal Jensen in the Communications Center told me that personnel shortages are creating unsustainable work schedules, but that reporting these concerns through the chain of command accomplishes nothing. Chief Warrant Officer Park in Maintenance mentioned similar issues with equipment that's documented as operational, but actually requires constant workarounds to function properly." Commander Petrov leaned forward. "Admiral, we've been dealing with budget constraints and manning reductions. Sometimes we have to make do with less than ideal situations. Making do is different from hiding problems," Irene replied firmly. "When I review your operational reports from the past 6 months, they paint a picture of a command operating at full effectiveness with no significant challenges. But my conversations yesterday revealed a very different reality. The question is why those realities aren't being honestly reported." Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the operations officer, spoke up carefully. "Ma'am, there's pressure from higher headquarters to demonstrate efficiency gains, to show that we can maintain capabilities with reduced resources. Reporting problems can be seen as making excuses or showing inability to adapt. That pressure exists everywhere," Irene acknowledged. "But the solution isn't to pretend problems don't exist. It's to document them accurately and advocate for the resources needed to address them properly. When we hide issues, we eventually face failures that could have been prevented." She moved to the next item on her agenda. "I also want to address leadership standards. Yesterday, I experienced and overheard conversations that revealed problematic attitudes about who belongs in certain positions, who deserves respect, who's capable of handling responsibility. These attitudes weren't universal, but they were present at senior levels where they have the most impact." The officers who'd confronted her yesterday looked particularly uncomfortable now, aware that their behavior was being discussed without being explicitly named. "Going forward, I expect leaders at all levels to evaluate people based on their demonstrated performance, not on assumptions about their appearance, age, gender, or background," Irene continued. "I expect you to create environments where junior personnel feel comfortable raising concerns, where problems are addressed rather than hidden, where competence is recognized regardless of who displays it." She paused, making eye contact with each person at the table. "I also expect you to hold yourselves to the same standards you hold others to. If you demand professionalism from your subordinates, you must demonstrate it yourselves. If you expect respect for the chain of command, you must show respect up and down that chain." Captain Reeves, the base logistics officer, raised his hand. "Admiral, what specific changes should we expect in how we buy, operate?" "I'll be conducting detailed reviews of each department over the next month," Irene replied. "I want to understand your actual capabilities, your real challenges, and the gaps between what you report and what actually exists. Based on those reviews, we'll develop plans to address systemic issues and improve our operational effectiveness." She closed her notebook. "I'm not here to punish people for past mistakes or to create a culture of fear. I'm here to build a command that operates with excellence and integrity. If you're willing to commit to that standard, we'll accomplish great things together. If not, you'll need to find somewhere else to serve." The following weeks revealed layers of complexity that Irene's initial reconnaissance had only begun to uncover. She established a pattern of arriving at different departments without advance notice, speaking with personnel at all levels, observing how work actually got done rather than how it was described in reports. In the maintenance bays, She found Chief Petty Officer Larson working on a radar system that had been officially operational for months, but actually required daily repairs to function. "We've reported it 3 times, ma'am," Larson explained, his hands covered in grease as he showed her the failing components. "Each time, we're told the parts are on order, but nothing arrives. So we keep it running with spare parts cannibalized from other systems." "Why isn't this documented in the equipment status reports?" Irene asked. Larson glanced at his supervisor, Lieutenant Foster, who stood nearby looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we were told that reporting too many deadline systems makes the command look poorly managed. The priority was keeping the operational readiness numbers high." Irene turned to Foster. "Lieutenant, is that an accurate representation of the guidance you provided?" Foster hesitated, clearly weighing his response. "Admiral, I was trying to balance realistic reporting with the expectations from the previous command leadership. There was significant pressure to maintain high readiness scores." "And you interpreted that pressure as permission to misrepresent our actual capabilities?" Irene asked, her tone sharp but not hostile. "I interpreted it as a need to be creative in how we documented situations," Foster replied carefully. "To show that we could maintain operations despite challenges." Irene made notes on her tablet. "Starting immediately, all equipment status reports will accurately reflect actual conditions, not aspirational ones. If we have systems that are deadline or marginally operational, that gets reported honestly. We'll deal with the higher headquarters questions when they come, but we're not going to build our command on false reporting." She turned back to Larson. "Chief, I want a complete inventory of all systems that are being maintained through workarounds or cannibalization. Full documentation of what parts are needed, how long they've been on order, and what the actual operational impact is. You have 72 hours. "Yes, ma'am," Larson replied, a hint of relief in his voice. "It'll be good to finally tell the truth about what we're dealing with." Similar discoveries emerged across the base. The communications center was chronically understaffed, requiring personnel to work 12-hour shifts 6 days a week to maintain coverage. The security detachment had outdated equipment that made their jobs harder but had been reluctant to request upgrades after previous requests were denied. The medical facility had been deferring maintenance on critical systems to stay within budget constraints. Each revelation reinforced Irene's initial assessment. The base was functioning through the dedication and skill of personnel who were making heroic efforts to compensate for systemic problems that weren't being acknowledged or addressed. She called another senior staff meeting after 3 weeks of these discoveries. The conference room held the same people as before, but the atmosphere had shifted. Word of her methodical approach had spread, and officers arrived with thick briefing folders containing information they'd previously been reluctant to share. "I've completed initial reviews of all major departments," Irene began. "What I've found is a command that's been operating under false pretenses. Not because of malicious intent, but because of a culture that prioritized looking good over being good." She displayed a chart showing the gap between reported and actual operational readiness across various systems. The difference was startling, nearly 20% in some areas. "These numbers represent the truth about our capabilities," she continued. "They're not as impressive as what we've been reporting to higher headquarters, but they're honest. An honest assessment is the first step toward real improvement." Commander Petrov raised a concern. "Admiral, when Brussels sees these numbers their way, will be questions about why they differ so dramatically from previous reports. There could be investigations, possibly relief of personnel who were responsible for the inaccurate reporting." "There will indeed be questions," Irene agreed. "And I'll answer them by explaining that I've changed the reporting standards to require accuracy rather than optimism. As for personnel actions, I'm more interested in moving forward than in punishing past mistakes, provided people are willing to embrace the new standards." She moved to the next slide, showing a comprehensive plan for addressing the identified deficiencies. "I've compiled our genuine equipment needs, personnel shortages, and facility requirements into a formal request for resources. This will go to Brussels with my full endorsement and detailed justification based on actual operational requirements, rather than theoretical calculations." Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked skeptical. "Ma'am, with all respect, headquarters has been denying resource requests for years. What makes you think this will be different? Because I'm willing to stake my credibility on it, Irene replied. And because I'm documenting that without these resources, we cannot maintain the operational capabilities that headquarters expects from this installation. They can either provide what we need or adjust their expectations about what we can deliver. The response from Brussels came faster than expected, driven largely by Vice Admiral Laurent's personal interest in how Irene's unconventional approach was progressing. He arrived unannounced one morning, his aide informing the base only minutes before his helicopter touched down. Irene met him at the landing pad, saluting as he emerged from the aircraft. "Admiral Laurent, welcome back to Base Poseidon." "Admiral Hill," Laurent replied, returning the salute. "Your reports have been generating considerable discussion in Brussels. I thought I should see firsthand what you've been doing. Here." They walked toward the command building, Laurent's practiced eye-taking in details of the base's operation. "I've heard that you've been making waves, questioning established procedures, changing reporting standards. Some people are concerned you're being too disruptive too quickly. Some people are probably the ones who preferred the previous system where problems were hidden," Irene replied calmly. "I assume you didn't come all this way to tell me to slow down, sir." Laurent smiled slightly. "No, I didn't. But I need to understand what you found and what you're proposing to do about it. Your resource request is substantial, and it comes with implicit criticism of how this command has been managed for years." Over the next several hours, Irene walked Laurent through her findings, showing him the maintenance facilities where Chief Larson demonstrated the workarounds required to keep systems operational, the communications center where personnel explained their unsustainable work schedules, the security detachment operating with outdated equipment. At each stop, Laurent asked detailed questions, his expression growing progressively more serious as he understood the scope of the issues. "This is worse than I expected," he finally said as they returned to Irene's office. "And I'm disturbed that these problems existed without being properly reported through the chain of command." "The problems were reported, sir," Irene corrected gently. "They just weren't reported honestly. There was a culture of making things look better than they were, of prioritizing good numbers over accurate ones." Laurent settled into a chair across from her desk. "Tell me honestly, Irene, how much of this is specific to this base, and how much is systemic across our installations?" It was a question Irene had anticipated. "I suspect these issues exist to varying degrees across many commands, sir. When headquarters creates pressure to demonstrate efficiency gains and maintain high readiness with reduced resources, commands respond by finding creative ways to meet those expectations. Sometimes that creativity crosses the line into dishonesty." "And your solution?" Laurent asked. "Change the incentive structure," Irene replied. "Make it clear that honest reporting is valued over optimistic projections, that identifying problems is seen as responsible leadership rather than admission of failure. Then provide the resources necessary to address legitimate needs or adjust expectations about what can be accomplished without those resources." Laurent was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "What you're proposing would require a significant shift in how we operate. There will be resistance from commands that have been successfully managing their images, even if not their actual operations." "I'm aware of that, sir," Irene said. "But the alternative is continuing a system where we don't really know our true capabilities until something fails catastrophically. I'd rather deal with uncomfortable truths now than preventable disasters later." "Show me your personnel," Laurent said abruptly. "The ones who've been making this base function despite the systemic problems." Irene arranged an informal gathering in the base cafeteria, inviting the enlisted personnel and junior officers who'd been most forthcoming during her initial reviews. Chief Larson was there, along with Corporal Jensen, Chief Warrant Officer Park, and a dozen others who represented the backbone of the base's operations. Laurent spent an hour speaking with them, asking about their challenges, their solutions, their concerns about the future. Irene watched him operate, seeing the same approach she'd used during her reconnaissance, the willingness to listen to people who weren't usually heard at the admiral level. "These are good people," Laurent said afterward as they walked back toward the command building. "Dedicated, skilled, frustrated that their reality doesn't match the official story." "Yes, sir," Irene agreed. "That's why I believe change is necessary." not just for this base, but as an example for how we should operate across all installations. Laurent stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Your resource request is approved. All of it. The equipment replacements, the personnel augmentation, the facility upgrades. You'll have what you need to fix the problems you've identified. Irene felt a surge of relief mixed with the weight of responsibility. Thank you, sir. I won't waste the investment. I know you won't, Laurent replied. But understand that Brussels will be watching this closely. You're being given the resources to prove that honest reporting and proper support can create better outcomes than managed appearances. If you succeed, it could change how we operate across the entire theater. If you fail, it will reinforce the old approaches. I understand the stakes, sir, Irene said. I believe you do, Laurent replied. That's why I supported your appointment despite the concerns about your age and experience. You have something many senior officers have lost: the willingness to challenge established patterns and the courage to demand better standards. 3 months after the change of command, Naval Base Poseidon had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The new equipment began arriving, proper maintenance schedules were established without the need for constant workarounds, and personnel manning reached sustainable levels that eliminated the punishing work schedules. But the more significant changes were cultural. Department heads now reported problems when they emerged rather than hiding them until they became critical. Junior officers felt comfortable raising concerns without fear that doing so would be seen as weakness. Enlisted personnel contributed ideas for improvements, knowing their input would be genuinely considered. Irene stood in the communications center, watching Corporal Jensen train too. New technicians on systems that now functioned as they were designed to. The difference from 3 months ago was remarkable, not just in equipment condition, but in the atmosphere of the space. How are the new people working out? She asked Jensen. Excellent, ma'am, he replied, his enthusiasm genuine. Having proper manning means we can actually train people thoroughly instead of throwing them into shifts before they're ready. The quality of work has improved significantly. And you're not working 70-hour weeks anymore? Irene asked. Jensen smiled. No, ma'am. Reasonable shifts, proper time off, actually able to maintain the systems instead of just keeping them barely functioning. It's like working in a completely different command. Similar conversations played out across the base. In maintenance, Chief Larson showed Irene the organized parts inventory, properly stocked with the components needed for regular upkeep. No more cannibalization, Admiral. When something breaks, we fix it properly with the right parts. It's revolutionary. The senior staff meetings had evolved as well. Officers now brought honest assessments of their departments, confident that identifying problems would lead to solutions rather than criticism. The competition to present the most impressive statistics had been replaced by collaborative problem-solving focused on real operational effectiveness. One afternoon, Commander Petrov requested a private meeting with Irene. He entered her office with the demeanor of someone who'd been wrestling with something significant. Admiral, I owe you an apology, he began once they were seated. Not for any specific incident, but for something more fundamental. I was part of the system that prioritized appearance over reality. I never actively lied in reports, but I also didn't push hard enough for honest acknowledgement of our challenges. You were operating within the expectations of the previous command structure, Irene replied. The question is whether you're committed to the current standards. I am, Petrov said firmly. What you've accomplished here in 3 months has shown me what's possible when a command operates with integrity. I've learned more about real leadership from watching you than I did in the previous 10 years of my career. Irene appreciated the honesty. You've been essential to making these changes work, Commander. Change can't come just from the top. It requires people at all levels willing to embrace new approaches. Speaking of which, Petrov said, I wanted to inform you that Lieutenant Commander Foster has requested a transfer. He feels that he can't move past his previous mistakes, that his credibility is permanently damaged. Irene considered this. Foster had been one of the officers most complicit in the false reporting, but he'd also been cooperative in implementing the new standards. What's your assessment? Can he be effective here going forward? I think he could be, Petrov replied, but I also understand his desire for a fresh start. Sometimes it's easier to apply lessons learned in a new environment rather than the one where you made mistakes. Approved, Irene decided. But I want his transition used as a teaching opportunity. Have him document the lessons he learned about the cost of false reporting and the importance of honest assessment. That documentation can help other commands avoid similar pitfalls. News of Base Poseidon's transformation spread through naval channels. Other base commanders began requesting briefings on Irene's approaches, curious about how she'd achieved such dramatic improvements. Vice Admiral Laurent used the success as evidence when arguing for broader reforms in reporting standards and resource allocation. 6 months into her command, Irene received notification that Brussels was sending an inspection team to evaluate Base Poseidon's operations. The message came from Vice Admiral Laurent with a brief note. They want to see if your approach is replicable or if you're just an exceptional case. Show them what honest leadership looks like. The inspection team arrived on a crisp autumn morning, led by Rear Admiral Kovac, a veteran officer known for his meticulous standards and skepticism of innovation. He'd built his reputation on traditional approaches to command, and rumor suggested he'd opposed Irene's appointment from the beginning. Admiral Hill, Kovac said, as they met in her office, his handshake firm but his expression reserved. I've heard remarkable things about what you've accomplished here. I'm interested in understanding whether the reality matches the reports. I welcome your scrutiny, sir, Irene replied. I'm confident you'll find our operations reflect our reporting accurately. Over 3 days, Kovac and his team conducted exhaustive reviews. They examined maintenance records, interviewed personnel at all levels, observed operations across every department, and compared current status reports with the documentation from before Irene's arrival. On the second day, Irene found Kovac in the maintenance bay, deep in conversation with Chief Larson. She approached quietly, listening to their exchange. So before Admiral Hill arrived, you were reporting this radar system as fully operational? Kovac was asking. Yes, sir, Larson replied honestly. We kept it functioning through constant repairs and part substitution, but it wasn't truly reliable. Now, with proper parts and maintenance schedules, it operates the way it was designed to. And you feel comfortable now reporting problems when they occur? Kovac pressed. Absolutely, sir, Larson said. The Admiral has made it clear that honest reporting is expected and valued. When we identify issues, they get addressed rather than hidden. Kovac made notes, his expression thoughtful. Later, Irene found him reviewing personnel records in the conference room, comparing work schedules from 6 months ago to current. Rotations. The reduction in average work hours is significant, he observed as she entered. How did you achieve this without reducing operational capability? By properly manning the positions instead of expecting people to work unsustainable schedules, Irene replied. The previous approach relied on personnel dedication to compensate for inadequate staffing. That works temporarily, but it creates burnout and eventual failure. The resource cost must have been substantial, Kovac noted. It was, Irene acknowledged. But consider the alternative cost. Personnel retention was declining, equipment failures were increasing, and we were one major incident away from a catastrophic breakdown. The investment in proper resources was actually the cost-effective choice. On the final day, Kovac requested a private meeting. His demeanor had shifted subtly over the inspection period, his initial skepticism replaced by something approaching respect. Admiral Hill, I came here expecting to find that your success was overstated, that the improvements were superficial or unsustainable, he began. I was wrong. What you've built here is genuinely impressive, not just in technical terms, but in creating a command climate that brings out the best in your personnel. Thank you, sir, Irene said. But I can't take credit for what the people here have accomplished. I just created conditions where their skills and dedication could be properly employed. Kovac smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need more of. I'm recommending that your approaches be incorporated into command training across all installations. The principles you've demonstrated, honest reporting, proper resource allocation, valuing personnel welfare alongside operational effectiveness, these should be standard practice, not innovative exceptions. He paused, then added, I also owe you an apology. I was among those who opposed your appointment, who believed you were too young and inexperienced for this responsibility. I allowed my preconceptions to override proper assessment of your qualifications. You've proven that leadership capability isn't determined by age or appearance, but by character and competence. I appreciate your honesty, sir, Irene replied. And I hope that recognition extends beyond just my case. There are capable officers throughout the service who face similar prejudgments. If my success helps open opportunities for them, that's almost as important as what we've accomplished here. The inspection team's report, when it was published, became required reading throughout the naval command structure. It documented not just the operational improvements at Base Poseidon, but the methodology behind them, the cultural changes that enabled them, and the leadership principles that sustained them. Within weeks, Irene began receiving requests to speak at command courses, to advise other base commanders, to contribute to policy discussions about how to replicate her success elsewhere. The young admiral who'd been dismissed as a political appointee had become a recognized authority on effective command leadership. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during a routine inspection of the communications center. A new ensign, recently arrived at the base, was working alongside Corporal Jensen on a complex system upgrade. "Is it true what they say about Admiral Hill?" the ensign asked, unaware that Irene was within earshot. "That she went undercover as a lieutenant commander before taking command?" "It's true," Jensen confirmed. "Best thing that could have happened to this base. She saw how things really worked, then had the courage to demand better." 1 year after assuming command, Irene stood in the same spot where she'd first observed the base, watching the sun rise over the Adriatic. The scene was physically unchanged, but everything else was different. The base that had been operating on false premises and hidden problems now functioned with transparency and genuine excellence. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from Vice Admiral Laurent. "Brussels wants to discuss your next assignment. Your work at Poseidon has made you valuable for bigger challenges. Call when you can." Irene smiled at the message but didn't respond immediately. There would be time for discussions about future assignments. This morning, she wanted to reflect on what had been accomplished here and what it meant for her own journey. The officers who tried to intimidate her that first day had become some of her most effective leaders. Brennan had embraced the new standards with genuine commitment, transforming from someone who valued appearance over substance into a department head who modeled honest leadership. Volkov had used the experience to examine his own biases, becoming an advocate for evaluating people based on performance rather than assumptions. Torres had requested additional training to expand his capabilities, recognizing that true competence required continuous growth. More importantly, the entire base had internalized the principles Irene had introduced. New personnel arriving at Poseidon found a command culture that valued honesty, supported professional development, and judged capability based on demonstrated performance. The changes had become self-sustaining, embedded in how the organization operated rather than dependent on her personal oversight. Commander Petrov approached across the parade ground, carrying a folder. "Morning, Admiral. The quarterly readiness report is ready for your review." "How does it look?" Irene asked. "Honest," Petrov replied with a slight smile. "We're at 87% operational readiness, up from the 68% we were actually operating at a year ago, even though we were reporting 95%. We have 3 systems still awaiting parts, 2 positions that need filling, and 1 facility upgrade that's behind schedule. In other words, we know exactly where we stand," Irene said. "Exactly," Petrov confirmed. "And because we know our real status, we can plan effectively and allocate resources appropriately. It's remarkable how much more efficient operations become when you're working from accurate information." Later that morning, Irene conducted her final official duty before responding to Laurent's message. The base theater was filled with personnel gathered for a promotion ceremony. Among those being advanced were Chief Larson, Corporal Jensen, and several others who'd been instrumental in the base's transformation. As she pinned new rank insignia on each person, Irene reflected on how far they'd all come. These weren't just promotions based on time and service. They were recognition of genuine excellence, of people who'd contributed to building something better than what they'd inherited. "A year ago," Irene said in her remarks after the promotions were complete, "this command was operating under false pretenses, not because anyone was malicious, but because we created a culture where honesty was discouraged and appearance was valued over reality. What you've all accomplished in transforming that culture is remarkable." She paused, looking at the assembled faces. Some had been skeptical of her initially. Others had been supportive from the start. But all of them had ultimately chosen to embrace the changes to demand better of themselves and their organization. "The real test of leadership isn't what happens while the leader is present," Irene continued. "It's what happens after they're gone. The standards you've internalized, the culture you've built, the commitment to honest excellence over managed appearance. These will endure, regardless of who commands this base in the future." After the ceremony, as personnel dispersed to their duties, Irene returned to her office to call Vice Admiral Laurent. Whatever assignment came next, she carried with her the lessons of Base Poseidon. That effective leadership required courage to challenge assumptions, commitment to honest assessment, and willingness to invest in people's genuine capabilities rather than managing their appearances. The young woman who'd been dismissed as too inexperienced, too young, too much of a political appointment had proven that leadership transcended demographics. She'd shown that real authority came not from rank or appearance, but from competence, integrity, and the courage to demand excellence even when it was uncomfortable. As she picked up the phone to discuss her future, Irene thought about all the other officers out there facing similar prejudgments, similar assumptions about their capabilities based on factors unrelated to their actual competence. If her success opened doors for them, if it challenged others to look beyond surface assumptions, then perhaps the most important accomplishment at Base Poseidon wasn't the operational improvements. Perhaps it was proving that capability comes in forms people don't always expect, and that the most dangerous assumption is believing you already know someone's limits before giving them a chance to exceed them. She smiled as Laurent answered the phone, ready for whatever challenge came next. After all, she'd spent a year proving that the impossible was just a matter of perspective, and she was looking forward to doing it again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.